I have spent over 6 years in grad school studying English literature. I have taken classes and taught classes. I've presented my work at conferences and had it published. I passed a 2-hour-long oral exam on a list of 115 texts related to my research, and I spent over a year and a half writing a dissertation on representations of hospitality and dysfunction in early modern English performance from 1585 to 1642. And now it's time for me to defend that dissertation. All of these years of work have all been leading to this, just this one last step, and then I will have my PhD. So it is time to prepare for the defense. I have 17 days until I defend my dissertation, and so my work now is to make sure I am completely prepared walking into that defense. Obviously, I have never done a dissertation defense before, but this is pretty similar in format to the qualifying exam that I had to sit for in order to pass on to the dissertation writing stage of my program. That exam took place almost 2 years ago. It was a 2-hour-long oral exam based on questioning me about the reading list I had put together of around 115 texts. My examining committee for that was made up of the same 4 professors who are still on my committee for the dissertation defense, and basically throughout this 2-hour exam, they took turns kind of coming at me at different angles, questioning how I had put together this reading list, what the main critical perspectives and primary texts I was working with were, and how all of these would fit into a dissertation project. And so right now, prepping for the defense feels pretty similar to how prepping for that exam felt. I've put together a list of questions that are the kinds of things I think I will be asked during this defense. So far, I have 31 of these questions. Some of these expected questions are general kind of big picture things I'm expecting to have to talk about, like what my critical intervention is, and some just broad questions about my argument and my scope within the dissertation, and some of the texts and principles of selection that I explained in the introduction that I expect my committee will kind of push me on during the defense. I also have a few expected questions listed for each chapter of things either that I personally think are kind of weak points that I think they might push me on, or just kind of making sure that I am able to defend my smaller arguments within each chapter in addition to the larger argument. And I've also written down some questions that I expect each of my committee members might ask me about. Obviously, I won't know the specific questions that I'm going to get asked. My advisor might give me some hints about the subjects that she's going to ask me about, and I already have some idea because we've been talking about this project for many years, so I know the things that she'll probably want to talk about. So I have more of a context for her, but the other 3, I feel pretty comfortable that I can guess areas that they'll push me on. I feel like I can guess partly because, like I said, I have worked with all 4 of these people before, and they examined me for my qualifying exam, so I have notes on the kinds of things that they asked me at that point, and I can go back to that. My project hasn't changed all that much since then, so I can safely assume that the kinds of things that they were interested in or were pushing me on then, they'll probably want to ask me about and push me on now. And I also know all of my professors' research specialties, so I can guess that each of them will ask me at least one question coming at my dissertation from their own perspective and area of expertise. Like, one of my professors works with eco-criticism and post-humanism, so she's probably going to push me to think about those concepts in connection to my discussion of like the pastoral, which I talk about in more abstract terms, but she's going to probably ask me to think about in more literal, embodied terms. One of my professors works mostly with women writers. She's going to push me on my discussion of gender and sexuality in the dissertation, and probably ask me to defend my choice not to include many women writers, which I am sad about that I didn't do. One professor talks about book history and print culture, so she's going to ask me to talk about hospitality in terms of print circulation and whether the physical object of a book can be considered a site where hospitality takes place, wherein the paratext of the object acts as a threshold over which the reader as a guest passes. I'm not just making that up. She asked me something like that during my preliminary exam, so I'm guessing she's going to circle back to that again. I have these things that I can make educated guesses on, and so I have written down sample questions, kind of pretending to attack myself from all these different angles. Of course, my committee is not actually going to attack me. The defense is not literal self-defense. I know this. Over the course of the next 17 days, I will work on coming up with more practiced answers to some of the things that I'm definitely going to be asked about. I will come up with a few little sound bites, as if I'm a politician writing a stump speech and then filtering in bits of it where I need to extemporaneously, depending on what questions I'm asked. My approach for today is just going to be to give myself random questions off this list, force myself to speak about them kind of off the cuff and see how it feels and see whether there's any glaring absences that I come across in my ability to answer any of these just off the top of my head. My advisor told me that I could walk into this defense tomorrow and walk out having passed. I don't know if that's true. That seems kind of crazy to me, but I do know that one of the things I need to work on in these next 17 days of defense prep is just feeling more confident and going into the defense, with confidence. I can do it. I can totally do it. In regards to chapter 3, talk through your critical scaffold and methodology in this chapter. What scholarship or historical contexts are most foundational in shaping your arguments here? Okay. So in chapter 3 of my dissertation, I am working primarily with the revenge tragedy, which is a genre that has generated a lot of critical attention before. So some of my work in structuring this chapter is just referring back to the existing work. This is terrible. Oh my God. Chapter 3 of all of the chapters in my dissertation, I had the most existing scholarship to draw on to structure a discussion of hospitality with regards to the specific texts I was working on. And that is because in this chapter, I'm talking through banquets and meta theater in revenge tragedy. And the banquet is such a thoroughly established trope in the revenge tragedy. So the main critical perspectives that I am stitching together in this chapter are related to the revenge tragedy itself as a genre, to the presentation of banquets on stage, as well as existing banquet practices in early modern England and kind of ideas about food on stage at the time. And I'm also drawing from staging and performance history context within this chapter, much more than in any chapter in this dissertation, even though all of the texts I'm working with throughout this dissertation are theatrical. This is really the chapter where I'm looking most at staging practices. And so these three different areas of critical work, I can't remember what the first one I said was. Start over. Okay. Talk through the critical scaffold and methodology in chapter 3. Okay. There are a lot of In chapter 3, there are really 3 dominant critical perspectives that I am drawing from and kind of stitching together and then looking at through my overarching lens of hospitality. And those three dominant perspectives are, in short, work on revenge tragedies, on banquets, and on lightning, theater, and performance history. Jesus fucking Christ. This is not, so far, going fantastic. In chapter 3, there are really three different dominant perspectives that I am bringing together and then looking at through the lens of hospitality. Those three perspectives, shortly put, are existing work on revenge tragedies, on banquets, and on theatricality and staging history. So with the work on revenge tragedy generally, we have just this substantial body of work on individual plays, the evolution of the genre, and tropes of the genre, which bleeds into the perspectives that I'm drawing from on the banquets. Of course, the banquet scene in revenge tragedy is one of the primary tropes of the genre. It pops up over and over again. I am certainly not the first one to notice or comment on that. And so in my work with banquets in this chapter, I'm partly drawing on previous scholarship that identifies the prevalence of the banquet in the revenge genre. But of course, I'm also talking about banquets as a theatrical event in themselves. That's drawing on, for example, the Sarah Mueller, or talking about banquets just in practice in early modern England, drawing there on Canal Bala and other scholarship related to that. And then with the work that I'm drawing on performance history and staging, that takes, again, a couple different angles. One is theatrical discourse historically situated in early modern England. So there I'm talking about anti-theatricality. I'm talking about these first anti-theatrical pamphlets and how they identify these ideas of contagion and moral corruption as being rampant on the commercial stage. But with regards to staging and theatricality in this chapter, I'm also drawing on some more contemporary scholarship. So that, for example, would be the Christine Steenberg or the Alison Findley, which talks about how performance evokes audience reaction and the affective capacity for staging. Alison Findley talks about mirror neurons and comes at it from this kind of cognitive science perspective about how what we see performed before us on the stage elicits a reflexive response, kind of, that we mirror back the emotions or the ideas that we see. And so with the Findley and the Steenberg both, we get this idea that performance is emotionally effective and it is also instructive, and it helps people kind of form views, opinions, and emotional responses to ideas. And so that is really underlying my discussion of meta-theater and meta-theatrical hospitality in these plays, is that the Revengers are returning to performance and the performative capacity of the banquet in order to elicit an audience response from the other characters on stage, in order to have a more emotionally effective performance of revenge, not just killing their enemy, but performing the murder of their enemy in order to satisfy this revenge. And then, of course, that bleeds out beyond just, pardon the grim pun, bleeds out beyond just what is happening on stage in that theatrical performance and towards the audience watching the performance, and turns it into this meta-theatrical hospitality event. I've got a little bit of work cut out for me. In chapter 4, you talk extensively about Othello as a guest. How is Othello's position as a conditional guest specific to his race and the position he occupies as an other? Don't you demonstrate throughout the dissertation that all guests are conditional and vulnerable to harm or rejection, you stupid bitch? You're not gonna say that. So it is definitely a core part of my, so it is definitely kind of one of the core principles of my idea of sinister hospitality, that no one is ever truly safe within hospitality, and that all hospitality contexts are conditional, as Derrida points us to, and as I talk about in this chapter. This idea of unconditional hospitality is impossible in practice because we can never fully allow ourselves to be vulnerable with an outsider. In Othello, we do see something that is very consistent with texts that I discuss elsewhere in this dissertation, and that just exist elsewhere in the body of early modern English work. I think that it is interesting actually to connect Othello to Romeo and Juliet and think about the kind of intruding guest who steals away the daughter from under the father's nose through gaining access through hospitality. That is a context that we see, or that is a situation that we see in Romeo and Juliet as well as in Othello. So this idea that the outsider is threatening specifically because he might marry your daughter and ruin your life is not specific to Othello's identity as a racial other. But what is specific to Othello as a character and as a play is this focus on his otherness explicitly within a hospitality context. When he is in Brabantio's home, his otherness is the focus of his presence there. Othello talks about how he basically traded travel narrative in exchange for entry into this home. He was allowed access to the home because his perceived exotic identity brought entertainment. And that is something that is substantially different from, for example, Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo is granted this conditional entry into the Capulets' home in that scene that I discussed in my introduction, where Capulet learns that Romeo is inside his house uninvited at this party. Capulet says, okay, the laws of hospitality are clear here. I shouldn't disrespect a guest in my home. And besides, he is well reputed. I see no reason that just because there is this feud between our families that I should deny him access once he's already here. That is a conditional welcome that is based just on the expectations of hospitality, that the host ought to be welcoming to his guest. And that is something that is very different from what we see in Othello, in which Othello has to trade on his otherness in order to gain access as a conditional guest. And then eventually it is that otherness, it is those enchanting travel narratives that cause Desdemona to fall in love with him that then create the conditions for him being expelled as a guest, that breaks the condition of his, oh my God. Pick a number 1 through 31.
It's 25.
25. In this dissertation, you reference Marcel Mauss's theory of the gift. How is gift theory similar or dissimilar to the idea of economy when you talk about an exchange within hospitality? Is this an economical issue? There is definitely room to talk about hospitality and gift exchange in economic terms. There's definitely room to talk about hospitality and gift exchange in economic terms, even through Marcel Mauss's work on the gift. For my purposes, and within the plays I have chosen to focus on within this dissertation, I don't really find the idea of economy productive. For example, in chapter 2. That is really the chapter in which I draw from Mouse the most in talking about Macbeth and Lear. And I think that in the exchange or failures of exchange, really, we see in hospitality within those plays, you could make the argument that I do not think I could walk into the defense tomorrow and pass. No, that's not true. I could walk into the defense tomorrow and pass. And embarrass myself, though. I'm gonna keep going. I just have to get used to talking about these things. The first pass at answers is not going to be good, but 17 days from now, my answers will be better. I will do some research and write down some notes so that I'm not scrambling. I will read through the whole dissertation again and it will be fresher in my mind and everything will be fine. Definition of unconditional hospitality you reference from Derrida deeply resonates with the definition of charity within medieval cycle drama, especially the York cycle play The Last Judgment. What connections or significance do you see in that? Thank you, Andrea, for that question. I agree that the York cycle, the play The Last Judgment, which is the Mercer's play in that cycle, holds a lot of interest or potential to be analyzed through hospitality. This is an example, yet again, of a play that does not specifically name hospitality, but is really presenting ideas of it. As a side note to my discussion of this play overall, in Act 3, Scene 2, there is a banquet in which Titus directs everyone to eat only as much as will preserve the strength in all his family. When Lavinia manages to communicate to her family what has happened to her, it is through referencing Ovid's Metamorphosis. There is definitely room to read Lavinia as a hostess in this final scene. What patterns, if any, do you see in the data about which authors, venues, and playing companies showcase your core concepts? Do plays about certain topics cluster around a particular time frame or appear more frequently in a certain company's repertory? In my approach to the commercial theater plays I work with throughout the dissertation, I made the decision to highlight the original performance context of these texts by referencing their date and company of first production. Within the scope of the dissertation project so within the scope within the parameters I set for my dissertation, I wanted to acknowledge the staging of these plays. I wanted to, at some points, discuss how the original stagings might have interacted with the content of the plays. For example, in chapter 3, I talk about Titus Andronicus being potentially staged in an inn yard and how that close proximity to kitchens and to the aromas and material life of an inn might have shaped audience reactions to the cannibalistic feast in the play's conclusion. So for moments like that, yes, I do dig in a little bit to performance history, but primarily what I was interested in across this dissertation was just tracking these patterns of dysfunctional hospitality and these different iterations of how the sinister element of hospitality is articulated through dramatic representation. And so this is something that I only touch upon in the dissertation in order to have that focus and consistency. I do think that in an expansion of this project, whether that is taking a bit and developing it out further into an article, or whether that is expanding the dissertation as a whole, building out certain chapters or adding more material to make it into a longer book, I think that there could be a lot of benefit in digging in deeper in some points to the staging and performance history of these plays. With something like King Lear, for example, I did not touch upon the original staging of that, which was that play is performed originally in front of King James at Whitehall's Banqueting House. And so that is something that in a more sustained, in a more expanded discussion of these elements, I would build out sections such as that. But within the dissertation, as I settled on its parameters for this, that is something that I did not feel, that did not end up making the cut. In Titus Andronicus, you only briefly mention Lavinia. Given how much attention you directed towards the figure of the hostess in chapter 1, is there any bridge you see between the discussion there and Lavinia's role potentially as hostess in this banquet scene? Thank you very much for that question. What an interesting observation. I think that whether we consider Lavinia to be acting as hostess in that moment, well, it definitely demands interpretation of Lavinia's character, as does... Let me restart my answer there for a second. I'm walking myself into a corner. I do definitely see Lavinia as acting as a hostess in that moment and as occupying a role of hostess, which is then undercut by the men participating in this hospitality moment, which is absolutely consistent with what I talk about in chapter 1 of all of these different iterations of a woman stepping into the role of hostess and then having her agency undercut because it poses too great of a threat. I see a lot of difference in how Lavinia is positioned as hostess in this moment. She is not placed in as much a position of control and authority. It is unquestionably Titus who is running the show, quite literally at this point. It's very theatrical, and Titus is clearly orchestrating that. But I do see Lavinia as acting agentially in this moment, and I say that because in the earlier scene in which Lavinia finally manages to communicate to her family what has happened to her, she does that by directing their attention to a section of Ovid's Metamorphosis in which she discusses the tale of somebody and somebody else. And that narrative of rape that she uses in order to illustrate what has befallen her is one in which the woman who is a victim organizes for a cannibalistic feast at which her attacker will be forced to consume the bodies of his children without his knowledge. And that, of course, is exactly what ends up happening at the revenge feast in Titus Andronicus. Titus is very connected to Roman tradition, obviously, so it is not surprising that this link is presented in the play, but what interpreting that link with the specific view of Lavinia's questionable authority, questionable just in terms of the fact that we have to question and interpret and read into everything she does once she loses the ability to communicate verbally. I think that what her use of that narrative suggests is that she is devising this banquet much in the way that I talk about early modern hostesses in chapter 1, devising these moments of hospitality which allow them to have creative control and domestic agency. So I do think that she is acting as a hostess in that sense, but of course the trouble of interpreting her desires persists as that scene wears on. The question of whether she intends for the banquet to result in her death is one in which I tend to side no. I don't personally think that, given her selection of that tale from Ovid, that is what she would have intended for the little theater spectacle of that banquet to lead to, given that the victim in that story does not die in the kind of Lucretian model, but instead is transformed into a bird. So I don't see Lavinia as capable or as granted the opportunity to have the kind of agency and control that the hostesses I discuss in chapter 1 do, but there is absolutely still a through line there in how women are able to assert themselves and to exercise creativity and agency through hospitality. those first couple days of practicing answering questions definitely made me feel more nervous and less confident for a little while, but that is just a stage that I needed to work through in order to get familiar speaking rather than writing about my work and get practiced at formulating a thorough but relatively brief answer. I definitely think I've improved over just these first few days of practice, and I have 2 full weeks still to dedicate to refamiliarizing myself with the dissertation and putting myself through my paces of answering potential questions. One thing that so far I'm not really happy with about the way I've been answering questions is that I have a tendency to speak kind of slowly and haltingly, and I think to ramble too much. But I am also reminding myself that I do speak differently when I am actually speaking to a person. In practicing this, I have literally just been staring out a window or at a wall. And I know that I will be putting my words together differently and my thoughts will be flowing a bit differently when I am actually facing people. I'm making eye contact with my committee. And I also know from what my advisor and other people have told me that the defense tends to function kind of conversationally. So I don't think that I will have just 6 minutes of uninterrupted space where I am rambling. I think that I will, for one thing, just myself be operating more conversationally, but also I will have my committee members interjecting or nodding along. I will have, verbal and visual clues to ground me rather than just it being me and my thoughts and staring at a fixed point on the wall. I have been feeling a bit more like academic insecurity and imposter syndrome in this past week than I usually do. I keep on feeling like I don't actually know what's in my dissertation and like I can't speak to my research, which I know is not actually true. For one thing, I wrote the dissertation. Obviously, I know what is in it. Those are my ideas. Those are my words, all 214 pages worth. But it's not a logical thing. It's an emotional thing. It's an anxiety thing to feel like I have faked my way through the dissertation and the PhD so far. I do know that my advisor never would have let me schedule the defense if I wasn't ready. I also know that my committee would raise their serious concerns to me if they had any before I enter into the defense. So I'm not worried that I'm going to fail, but I just really want to feel confident going into this that I can do a really good job. I want to be proud of the way that I conduct myself throughout the defense, and I want to be able to look back at the defense as a point where I, followed through on these years of research and that I reached a satisfying conclusion to my academic journey. I just want to go in strong and to come out feeling like I did everything I could. This is definitely not the first time that I have felt imposter syndrome and have felt a lack of confidence in my work. And the approach that I like to take is rather than giving myself a confidence boosting speech and telling myself that I'm not an imposter. Instead, I just tell myself that if I have made it this far as an imposter, that must mean that I'm really good at it. And if I'm that good at faking it, then I can continue to fool everyone around me until I get to the finish line. So that's just what I'm going to keep on doing. I feel very stressed and anxious about having only 12 days until the defense, but the good thing about that is that I will feel something else 13 days from now. I only have 12 more days to feel this exact way, and then the defense will happen and it will be behind me. And hopefully what I feel is happy and relieved and proud of myself. But either way, I will feel something else. I can do it. And then it will be done.